A big welcome back to our listeners and viewers of the Responsible Ed podcast, brought to you by the Anti-Greenwash Charter. Today, I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by Edward Bulmer. Edward, thank you so much for giving up some of your time this Friday morning to join us for a show.
Thank you for asking me, Charlie. It's my pleasure. It's important stuff.
Indeed it is, Edward. Indeed it is. Now, I have known you for a period now and had the pleasure of sitting on a panel discussion with you as well. So I have been earmarking this conversation as being one that I'm particularly looking forward to, knowing that I've sort of sat by you and seen you in full flight when looking at exploring some of the themes that we're going to go into today. But for the first kind of 20 minutes or so, we've got an opportunity to share with our listeners and viewers that don't know about you and your background and your experience, a real flavor of who Edward Bulmer is and the experience that you've had. So, and particularly through the lens of kind of ethics and responsibility and sustainability, I'd like us to kind of share your story. So take us back, if possible, to the beginning. Take us back to, your childhood, your early adolescence, perhaps even, what you did at university or higher education and the early part of your career. But give us a flavor of you.
Of course. I guess the most telling thing is to say that I grew up on a farm. I've noticed that when I'm on panels with people who make sense, there's an extraordinary correspondence between that and the fact, I think, that they're making so much sense. Effectively, it means you've grown up surrounded by the natural growing cycle. So I grew up in rural Herefordshire. My family have been here for a goodish time. Much of the last 100 years or so of the family's activities have been making cider. The Bulmer cider business, though, was sold ultimately to Heineken in the early part of this century. And so while I'd never joined that company, I was very much inculcated into a tradition of family and business being two sides of the same coin, really. And that particular family business was quite innovative in the sense of how it addressed the needs of workforce. And it's interesting, in brewing, Guinness was the same, and also you might say in some of the Quaker businesses like Clark's or Cadbury's or what have you. Some really interesting businessmen recognized that there was a very deep connection between the well-being of your workforce and their productivity. It sounds pretty obvious, but that well-being, of course, is much harder to ensure and deliver, and it relies not just on good and, I think, kind and fair working relationships when you're at work, but of course it really relies on what happens when you're not at work too. Is your housing adequate? Do you have clean water? Do you have ways to look after the family that can be met when you're at work as well as when you're not? And interestingly, this company did actually go beyond that, have very good labor relations, never had a strike, one of the first companies to have an employee ownership scheme, and very good lengths of service and social interaction in work, but also established the odd charity. The main one is still going, and interestingly was set up for the alleviation of poverty and sickness in the case of any member of the family or their wider family, and particularly recognized surfeit of children. Not perhaps a preoccupation now, but in the past, as we know, and still in underdeveloped so-called parts of the world, large families are the norm, and they're a reflection usually of infant mortality, of an acknowledgement that many hands make light work, and more people can bring income to the family, etc. So,
and Edward, sorry, I'm sorry to interrupt you in full flight here, but are we talking here about the formative sort of experience that you had of observing Bulmer's and the way that it went about treating its people as being a really fundamental lesson that a young Edward learned about the way that he wanted to do business. Is that what we're getting to here?
Charlie, I was proud of that company.
Mm.
I was genuinely proud of the company. It in the end, it wasn't a totally a family business. So half of it was sold and the company was floated. And you could say that was the sort of beginning of the end. It often is for most family businesses, but we managed for 3 to 4 generations. And ironically, it still belongs to a family business. It's the Heineken family, not our family. And it didn't end up. It's very interesting. Now you can make very large businesses, much larger than Bulmer's ever became, in one career. Mm-hmm. But ours, took 3 generations. And that was partly because the aspiration wasn't just to make a shed load of money. It was those normal aspirations that we all have, which is to look after our family first and foremost. And once we can comfortably do that, to see what we can do for our neighbors, basically. And I think that's very obvious to say in a way, but there's something about business that's allowed us to excuse ourselves of that notion. Mm. And there's also a sense that the key driver behind capitalism is no ceiling to the amount of wealth you or your company could amass. Mm-hmm. And so hand in hand with that goes there being no ceiling to the salaries you can be paid. And so the gaps we now see between, frankly, the people who are usually doing most of the work and the kind of management and executive levels of those companies is, I think, wrong, quite wrong. I think the disparity between the lowest and the highest paid in some of these huge businesses is quite wrong, and we should all be unhappy about that.
And Edward, just to draw a comparison with the family founded, family run businesses, is it your estimation that because of the nature of a family founded business and that whole idea of looking after one another, looking after the people, if you like, at the very origin of the inception or the founding of that company, that it's less likely within those scenarios that you're going to have this degree of disparity between, management and the frontline workers being paid, a sort of a completely different ballpark of salary figure? Is that a too big a bolder generalized statement to make, or do you think that that's the beauty of family founded and family run businesses?
I think it's a generalized statement, but I think it's also one that it's not hard to accept, because we all have a family at one level or not, and most of us kind of look for fairness in family dialogue and family affairs. And so if you actually have to answer to someone face to face, it's a lot harder than being in, the C-suite on the 65th floor of an office block with a factory probably 50 miles away or even the other side of the world. And so I think that disconnection is probably part of it. And of course, families that are by their nature, they can grow, but they're limited in scope.
And Edward, just on this, sort of just provide context for our listeners and viewers. You've grown up with this influence, if you like, of seeing Bulmer's and witnessing sort of the way that it worked and being proud of the way that the business grew and developed. What do you do in the early part of your career? You mentioned you didn't join Bulmer's. Like, what was the early part of your career, and what was the areas of interest for you at that stage?
Well, I will tell you, but I didn't join Bulmer's, but I did join a charity that the company and the family established called the Bulmer Foundation, which was about promoting sustainability and the advocacy of sustainability. And one of the really interesting projects they'd undertaken was to say, take a company like Bulmer's and ask what is its impact on society, because of course it's producing alcohol. So the abuse of alcohol is a significant social harm. So try and quantify it and try and apportion it to the brewing industry or the alcohol industry, and accept that while you can say, not my problem, the problem does exist. What percentage of it are you responsible for because you're an alcohol company? And the same with your carbon emissions and your waste streams and all of that. And it was a really impressive piece of work that showed that the company could actually internalize all those externalities that the capitalist allows, and still actually probably only cost it a relatively small percentage. I'm saying like 10% of turnover. Well, that's significantly less than the tax that was being paid to government because it was an alcohol company. So the nascent project, it ran out of steam, I'm sad to say, but the nascent project was to go to government and say, if we act in concert and try and stave off the harm before you have to tax the companies you deem to be creating the harm on behalf of society, that actually we could be much more effective. Anyway, long story short, the charities survived, but the business didn't in our hands. And I did realize, though, after 10 years that we were doing incredible work, which frankly no one was really paying any attention to. And that is really, really hard, even in a small area like Herefordshire, where our entire county, 84 square miles, has the population of Oxford. So we can talk to ourselves relatively easily, you might say, and we can get very easy access to all the main agents in the county, from the county council to the health authority to the rural charities and what have you. But even then, we could all kind of agree with each other, but we quickly got into the weeds in sustainability, and then budget holders would change and. And so I began to realize that it was really important just to only attempt to do something that you truly did have agency over. And my career by then, and has always been actually, is in interior design. It's what I've done since leaving university, where I studied.
Sorry, Edward, just let me understand the timeline of events. So in terms of joining the Bulmer's Foundation, that happened after you had begun your career as an interior designer?
That did, yeah.
Right, okay. So university, interior design, then interior design career, then the Bulmer's Foundation, and then we're going to go on to talking about what happens with Edward Bulmer Paint. But just take us back to, yes, before I interrupted you, take us back to the interior design days.
That's right. So I left university in 1984 and had a year in advertising, followed by a year with an interior designer called David Milonaric, who specialized in historic buildings, followed by a year working for the National Trust, researching in some of those buildings.
Oh, wow.
And then I went independent and just partnered one particular guy who's actually a picture restorer called Alec Cobb for 6 years. Incidentally, that's where I learned about pigments. So it was a necessary part of my journey. And I learned a great deal about English country houses, which was the main area I've been working in ever since.
And Edward, let me just ask you on that. What was interior design, was aesthetic and beauty and interior design always sort of an interest and passion for you growing up? And was it just a sort of a very natural sort of early part of your career your education, higher education, and into the early part of your career for you to pursue that? Was that just part of you?
Yeah, so my family actually built themselves houses within a stone's throw of each other on the edge of Hereford and near Credden Hill, where the first cider was produced, where the SAS are now stationed, Stirling Lines. And my father broke with tradition for his own reasons and bought an old Georgian house that needed some. It was an old rectory, in fact, that needed some love and care. And he and my mother put a great deal of love and care into it. While I was born in London, very, very early on, I was moved to live there, 1969, I think. And so, yes, I grew up surrounded by the kind of pleasing symmetry of Georgian architecture. And my father developed a keen interest in the furnishing of it and acquiring pictures for it and what have you. And he actually employed the interior designer, David Milinarik, who later employed me. Yes. So yes, it was very much formative influence. We'd often go and visit National Trust houses and that sort of thing on the way to holidays in Scotland. And when I left school with a not very inspiring set of academic results, it seemed a good idea to carry on my education for a while. So it was actually my father that suggested history of art. And actually, history of art is an interesting subject because it perhaps comes across as a tiny bit kind of lightweight and dilettante, but in fact, it can be very forensic, and because it's subjective, and most academe tries to form an objective exercise, you have to effectively come up with some form of opinion or observation, and then support it with the evidence that the art shows you, as it were. So actually, it stood me in really good stead, and two particularly of my lecturers there really helped me to question. And it sounds very obvious, but I think I still meet an awful lot of people who don't question things in life. And the ability to question without being tarsomely skeptical, I think, is very important. It's the only way you learn, I would say.
But that's so fascinating that you can go back and pinpoint that it's the subject that afforded you the opportunity to learn the skills and build the confidence, presumably, to be able to ask the right questions at the right time and for that to play out. So, Edward, I know you can see we're already blitzing through our first 20 minutes talking about you, and I feel like we could just do a whole show on Edward Bulmer and learning your background. We will be linking to your LinkedIn profile for anybody that wants to go and sort of go into the weeds, if you like, of what Edward's experienced. But let's just jump forward if we can now, Edward. And I want to now talk about possibly what happens after you leave the Bulmer Foundation. And you mentioned that agency, and that I can just sense that frustration that you felt having put loads of great work into the 10 years that you mentioned. And as you say, feeling like nothing necessarily really changed or evolved as a result. What happens next? What do you decide to do at that point?
I should say, en passant, that the Bulmer Foundation changed its name to Bright Space Foundation and still exists. And some of the best projects it did still exist. So it has a lasting legacy. But I felt that I would be able to make more difference, because ultimately that's what the purpose of the charity was, by actually doing something that I had real and relevant skills in. So the interior design journey is relevant to that because the early part of this century, I was working at Goodwood, known to many for horse racing or motor racing, a spectacular place on the south coast, and one that has extraordinary kind of creative and commercial energy. But we were involved with redecorating some of the staterooms, but also adding to the house to make some rooms that would allow the family to live in a more conducive way, because much of the house is given over to office space now and a constant stream of functions. So So a small number of rooms were added to the building, and I was responsible for helping with the redecoration of them. And what the brief was, Janet and Charles March, they're called, or Richmond now, was, we know you'll do it beautifully and historically sensitively, etc. But we would like everything to be environmentally responsible and non-toxic, in fact. So not to risk any health hazards to their young family.
And just for context for our listeners, I imagine they'll want to know this. Give us a timing of this. When was, because this feels like a fairly pioneering request.
Yeah, it's about the year 2000 probably.
Okay.
But actually, Janet March's uncle was called the Astor Charles. Anyway, Janet March's uncle started the Ecologist magazine.
Ah, yes.
And there really is actually still no, although it's merged with Resurgence, there's still no publication that routinely addresses our stewardship of planetary ecology. Masses on economy, lots of great ecological articles, if you like, in this or that periodical, from kind of The Guardian through to all the Science and Nature and all of that. So it was in her DNA to some extent, and the Goodwood estate was at the time the largest organic farm in Europe. So, and of course, while we focus on the kind of petrol heads at the Festival of Speed and what have you, there's an awful lot of cutting edge, innovative motor racing technology there. It's always an electric car that wins the hill climb, for instance, and of course horse racing. If you want sustainable racing, then horse racing is up the hill and available. But no, it was a, as you say, it was a very pioneering brief in that respect. And what I realized was that because my specialism was in historic work, really, my materials were therefore historically drawn or informed, and effectively that meant they were all derived from natural materials. Now, that's not to say that all natural materials are non-toxic, of course, but they do, on the whole, have significantly less pollution burden than modern materials that are so now reliant on hydrocarbons or the use of hydrocarbons to give us the energy systems for processing all the materials themselves. And so I went through my repertoire: leather, wood, plaster, wool, stone, whatever. And yes, of course, some are extractive, some industries, if you're vegan, you're not keen on leather. Everything has issues. But in terms of environmental responsibility, I deemed that the one that really had the issue was paint. It was in the early days of kind of Farrow and Ball, and I had worked with Tom Helm, who started Farrow and Ball as we know it, and I asked him, therefore, about what went into paint making. Didn't for whatever reason didn't learn a great deal, so I had to really kind of do my own forensic history of art style deep dive. Uncovered things like the World Health Organization actually summarizing their research as painter decorators had a carcinogenic profession. That was not very happy news. And of course, then the penny dropped that even though we had from the 50s embraced polymer technology to make what's called resin dispersion paints, those polymers were created from monomers, one from steam cracking, or retort chemistry it's called, the waste from fuel refining. So aka their petrochemicals, their plastic the plastics. So that was a kind of no to kind of Farnball or what have you. But we did use a variant of one of their paints, which was based on, it wasn't one of their paints, but one of their paints was a casein paint in those days. And we used a pure casein paint. Casein is the protein in milk, but it provides a very good binder. And
sorry to interrupt you again, but was this the moment you mentioned about leaving Bulmer's Foundation and wanting to find that opportunity to have impact? Was it immediate for you, or sorry, a greater impact? Was it immediate for you when observing the issues around modern paint at this moment that you thought, here's the opportunity for me to, with agency, go and affect real change relating to the use of this material? Was it a light bulb moment, is what I guess I'm asking?
No.
Okay.
But, the result was so beautiful. The art historian in me became very intrigued. Because I'm thinking, this is the beauty that was experienced by people who used paint in the past. So then I started to think about the history of paint and paint making. And actually, I don't think there's any product that's been in longer use by us than paint. We've been using it for 40,000 years now.
Look at the cave paints of Australia and all the rest of it. Yes,
exactly. So, in fact, it's quite an interesting proposition to say the way I've made paint in the last 50 years is better than the preceding 39,950. Particularly as in terms of kind of product testing, there is nothing like that. And as you know, yes, the cave paintings still exist. So absence of UV will be helping that, etc., etc. But there are many paints that have done such a good job that we have a vast holding of historic fabric, particularly timber. And so what was going on? And effectively what we were doing was identifying materials in nature. So back in the Paleolithic, we could literally see the color in the hillside because it was colored earths. And we'd discovered fire, so we knew how to create soot and collect soot. We could boil down bones, so we knew how to make rudimentary sizes, and we knew about water, and we knew about white minerals like chalk and lime. So we had the basics of what are still the basics of paint making today, which is the pigment for the color, the binder to mix it together and then make it stick to something, and the solvent or the diluent to make it wet enough to do so. That is still effectively the rudiments of paint making: pigment, binder, and solvent.
And Edward, you'll see that the time is rattling on, and I'm so intrigued to sort of conclude this introduction to yourself by giving our listeners and viewers an understanding of this observation or this realization in sort of the early 2000s. Like, what's that led to now? Where are we sitting now? What are you involved in at this stage?
So what the penny dropped that what we were doing when we used paint was covering everything in a thin layer of plastic. And there was no other material application, whether it be curtain material or flooring or whatever, where my clients would allow that. They would think it was mad. So why is it that we're so happy to embrace plastic paint? And the answer, spinning forward to 2010, when we actually started to legislate paint a little bit, actually on behalf of the ozone layer, but we won't have time to discuss that. We by and large change most of our formulations to these water-based resin dispersion paints. Think of them as emulsions. So most, even on woodwork now, most paint we're using is effectively an emulsion paint. And the industry, in marketing terms, realized that they now had a very attractive claim, which was that the paint was water-based. Water, therefore, is safe, and you needn't worry yourself about any of the other ingredients. And that is where we still are, by and large. So the paint makers have embraced that ability to market certain virtues that they assume the consumer wants with deeper and deeper skill. And we are now at a point where a subset of that, which is about how they're being environmentally responsible, this phrase eco-friendly came along, how they're looking after the planet. This is now a whole subset of advertising and marketing for paint and many other products. But if you want to look behind that, which you would only do if you thought what you were being told was not perhaps the whole story, you will find another story, which indicates that the story that we have at the moment is, I think, Charlie, what you and I would characterize as fairly reliant on greenwashing.
True.
Yeah. And greenwashing is helpful on one hand because it's acknowledging on the part of industry, if you like, that consumers naturally have an interest in the health of the planet we all inhabit.
Mm-hmm.
But the
health of the interior experiences that they're confronted with. There's an eagerness to understand those implications too. But yes, Edward, go on.
Correct. And the washing, you might suppose, was good for us too, because washing is deemed to be clarifying and what have you. But obviously where the washing in this case comes from is by dropping the white in whitewashing and substituting green. So whitewashing in kind of political terms is seen as a deliberate obfuscation exercise. So what we identified was that there was an awful lot to like about the old way paint was made. So speaking to someone recently on our same journey, it's encouraging to talk to people on your journey together with you, even if it's an echo chamber. You feel a little bit less lonely, don't you?
Indeed. The benefits of the echo chamber, I love that. Go on.
They came up with the phrase ancient wisdom and innovative science. And I think that that's a very powerful concept. And so what we have actually done is ally ourselves to the innovative science. But by tagging on the ancient wisdom, if you like, my version of art history and the history of paint making, we, I think, have got a more rounded product, which now we have to ask ourselves, how do we present this to the public? Because frankly, pretty much everybody in the world will buy a tin of paint at one point, in such a way that everything they bring to bear in the sense of what's appropriate for my own health, for the health of my family, for the care of my surroundings, neighborhood, etc., it is obvious and coming into play. And one of the reasons that's so hard for us, well, there are two principal reasons. One is that people know nothing about paint. I'm not saying it's not boring, but they nevertheless know nothing about it to even know if it's boring or not. And the other is, I think, the very effective greenwashing that's going on. And one of the classic technique that industry has taken on is to make the pollution that results from not just the product, their product, or the end life of their product, but the way they make it in the first place, to make that ours. So you've got a problem to to address out there, members of the public. You need to recycle. You need to choose organic. You need to do this and that. And I think that's completely wrong on every level. I think it's morally wrong. I think it's anti-sustainable because we simply don't have enough resources for that. And so I think that business needs to address this, not because it's sustainable. It's because, frankly, every business needs two things, I think. One is, or aspires to two things. One is profit and the other is permanence. And permanence is AKA sustainability. And therefore, if you don't embrace sustainability, you're accepting extinction, aren't you, or the possibility of. And that's the world we now live in. And it's very tough. I accept it's very tough because it's a big issue that the way we've been doing business hitherto has created. And to shift your mindset away from business as usual is proving incredibly hard.
And Edward, I have to say that was one of the most brilliant first parts of the show we've ever had. I feel like I could just let you carry on and provide us with this this fantastic insight into not just your own experience and what you're doing at Edward Bulmer Paint, which, by the way, we will be linking to Edward Bulmer Natural Paint so that all of our listeners and guests can check out the brilliant work that the guys are doing and sort of get a real sense of from what Edward's been saying there, how the organization is going about trying to address, you know, some of these industry issues, if you like. So, Edward, picking up on that point that you've just made there, which I think is a very well positioned and well made observation. I wanted to ask you about your view of the case for sustainability within a commercial context, really over the course of the last year or so, factoring in, I think, obviously developments from across the pond and this whole, and I hate using the term, but ESG backlash, if you like, that seems to be going on, not just in terms of environmental sustainability, but I guess related to some of the DEI and other social elements, if you like, related to sustainability. Just give us your flavor on the sort of state of play and actually perhaps sort of align it with your own lived experience of running a sustainability focused entity. And how you feel it's been over the course of the last year.
So I think that we are absolutely not where I thought we would be halfway through this decade, which we effectively started internationally as recognizing that really major structural shift was needed this decade if we were going to meet any of these targets, whether you want to call them net zero or sustainability goals or whatever. I mean, they are, to repeat myself, they are literally about how the human race continues to inhabit the planet. So it doesn't really matter whether you choose different words for them or whether you're Tony Blair and says net zero is too politically difficult. That doesn't solve the issue. The issue remains there. And the longer we take to address it, the less likely our chances of successfully addressing it, and certainly the more costly it will become.
Do you, Edward? Can I just ask you a direct question on that? How optimistic are you that we are going to get our house in order? Like, what's your barometer on? You said we're not where you'd want us to be, but how hopeful are you that we actually will be able to get get to where we need to get to?
I'm optimistic that there are more and more people addressing these issues, but it is very hard to put up with the amount of pessimist-inducing information that's spewed at us from the media, and they're regurgitating it for all of their own reasons. For some reason, they think Farage or Blair's latest opinion is important to us. And they would have no idea who Satish Kumar or someone who could actually feed us spiritually would be. So they would never give him a platform, and so many other great thinkers we never hear from our indigenous peoples. There are many human beings who we have so much to learn from. But the business as usual and the present incumbency have deemed, for whatever reason, that somehow the pursuit of money is going to make everything all right. So when scientists last week, I think, said that it's now looking impossible to meet our 1.5 degrees of warming internationally agreed upper limit in 2015 in Paris, that is now much more likely to be 3 degrees. 3 degrees is really, really significant. I mean, if you think of it in our kind of built environment terms, that's cities like Miami or Shanghai or Rio mostly being under seawater. But if you think about what that can be doing to the food systems, etc., it's really existential. And yet Morgan Stanley, because, you know, we address everything through the lens of the money supply, Morgan Stanley, one of the world's biggest investors, and say, acknowledge that the scientists have just told us this, and then say, we think there'll be great investment opportunities in companies making air conditioning. And I find that, actually, you know, I'm a human being too, but I find it really hard to know how you can think that that's okay. So, yes, I have some very pessimistic moments, and it doesn't really, I'm not going to tell you what I actually think, because optimism is the only currency that's any use. And I have no fears for the planet, incidentally. It's just whether it remains like planet Earth or whether it becomes more like Venus. But, you know, Venus is a very beautiful, beautiful planet, but doesn't support any life, unfortunately. And so I would rather that we discounted the idea of getting into rocket ships and finding some other planet that we can start all over again with, and revert to the idea that this planet and its management technique, aka Gaia, is the most extraordinary gift to every living organism, of which we're a tiny subset, frankly. And that it's just shitting on your own doorstep not to do anything about it, isn't it? It's just crazy. But no one's telling us that. No one's putting it in those terms. Oh, it's all too doom laden. It's all too hair shirt. We can't possibly have fewer holidays or whatever is the kind of automatic reaction. But what about all the upsides of living in a different way that actually means our grandchildren might be able to inhabit the planet, and actually our lives might frankly be a bit more meaningful too? We don't have those discussions to anything like the same degree.
That is such a well-made point. I had a show recently where we were literally talking about the need for more aspirational communications around sustainability. We need to actually pitch what life could look like if we get this right, as opposed to what necessarily could go wrong and how terrible things could look. And there needs to be that narrative as well. But equally, we need to position for people the optimism, if you like, around the aspiration of what the world could look like if we get things into order. Let me ask you, Edward, a practical question. You kind of alluded to it there, but if you're making decisions as Edward Bulmer Natural Paint, whereby you have a commercial consideration about something that, you know, a decision to partner with somebody, a decision to utilize a certain supplier or whoever else it might be, whatever else it might be. And you're factoring in the thinking around, well, yes, that might be the purely best commercial outcome that we can realize, but there's another consideration here, which is the sustainability of our decision making, the sustainability of our organization. What would be your argument to other leaders of businesses who are sat there going, do you know what? The sustainability element is just a nice to have. It's something that we can factor into our marketing or our branding or our positioning, but ultimately I'm going to make my decisions based upon the commercial outcomes I'm trying to realize. What would be your argument to that fellow leader?
Well, I mean, I think effectively you snooze, you lose. The climate effects are only accelerating, I'm afraid. So it doesn't matter what you do in your business, that's not going to have any effect on climate breakdown, I'm afraid. The only thing that might help your business having consumers in the future, which is presumably what you want, is if they are able to have a disposable income over and above their everyday needs. And those everyday needs are going to become more and more expensive. And already a sixth of us live in homes that are liable to flooding. So we probably can't even get insurance, but flooding insurance is only going to become more expensive. And there are going to be countless examples, quite apart from our totally everyday survival needs like food and water, where our household costs increase. And so the more that we're spending on that, you may be licking your lips because you're a supermarket or something, but the more we're spending on that, the less we're spending on anything else. Yeah. And what fires me up about our commercial project is that every part of it can return profit to me. There is no aspect of it that I can't talk about without being able to solve some particular problem. So you need a breathable coating because you've got a precious historic building. I can solve your problem. If you need a paint that is not leaching any form of chemicals that you might have multiple chemical sensitivity to, I can solve your problem. If you want, frankly, the most beautiful paint on your wall that I've ever seen, I can solve your problem. If you want to have paint with, low carbon emissions and responsible raw material use, I can solve your problem. If you want my paint to break down and be returnable to nature and find organisms already present in nature who will not see waste, they'll see food, I can solve your problem. If you want me to give, great messaging, be available on every podcast in the country, channel that wants to talk about sustainability, I can solve your problem because it really is a struggle to save humankind. So it's that very fact de-risks anything I do for me. Yeah, my business is built on securing it on my house, etc. I could lose my house. But hey, in the context of things, that's nothing compared to losing the ability to inhabit the planet, is it?
Let me ask you on that point, because I think you've provided a perfect rebuttal to anyone out there that's in a similar position to yourself that's ultimately not factoring these considerations in, and that was beautifully put. Well, how does it make you feel personally now? You've mentioned about your career and working within the Bulmer Foundation, like working on Edward Bulmer Paint, and you're clearly so passionate and energized by this work that you're doing. How is that for you personally? Like, what's the experience like for you of building this organization?
I think actually it's a lifesaver. I am a bit glass half full as a character type, and I think the one thing that does help me counter the information I receive, which I admit I go looking for, because I follow good sources of sustainability news, as it were. The only way I can counteract that is not to be thinking, well, I don't believe that that problem really exists, because I can just see it. I live in the countryside. I can just see the problem exists. Everything is different. Yesterday was the hottest 1st of May we've ever recorded. Every day there's just another signal that what the climate scientists have been trying to warn us about is here and here to stay. So I find it really, I actually couldn't do business any other way now. I really couldn't. I really genuinely ask myself how you could work in a fossil fuel business now and have a meeting with a lobbyist or a greenwasher or what have you, and say, here's some more millions, or put millions toward a leader of the so-called free world whose kind of shenanigans are reported on a daily basis. But the really important stuff he's done is all the rollout for the fossil fuel industry. And he's doing Steve Bannon's, flood the field with shit kind of thing. So we're all noticing that, and that MAGA hats are made in China. But the really important stuff is that he's licensing deep sea mining, that he's licensing the deforestation of vast swathes of American forests. You know, I mean, he's really challenging an awful lot of what the so-called American dream is kind of based on, but he is nevertheless representing 4 years of potential harm, whether he manages to buy Greenland in the end or not. But that's a recognition of Arctic melt, which is a big, serious issue for the UK, for instance, whether he does or not. Those 4 years, and don't forget the opportunity missed of another 4 years of what Biden's New Deal was achieving. That is potentially, existential. That is potentially going to be taking us to a place that we can't come back from. But nevertheless, because I think that so many of our systems are run by money, you could foresee a future where the oil, the shale gas, whatever, we allowed it to still be worth what it is as reserves, but actually we're going to pay you to keep it as reserves. And that money you're going to use to create a renewable energy infrastructure instead. I mean, I'm no economist, I'm no capitalist, but it doesn't seem to me that it's ever going to work telling business as usual that they must close their business.
Here, Edward, here. How incredibly pragmatic and realistic. Now, you alluded to there a potential magic wand or use of the magic wand. I am going to have to pull it to a close. Edward, I could talk to you for hours. I honestly could. And I'm sure our listeners would love to continue to have you on. We're hopefully going to be able to get you back on for another show if you've enjoyed yourself today. But let me conclude now with the magic wand question. Edward, if I was to hand you a magic wand right now and you could change one thing about the commercial world, what would that one thing be?
Well, transparency, I suppose. And I will give you an example, because I mean by transparency in the interest of the consumer. So for paint, for instance, if I had a magic wand that could get me one bit of legislation, it would be that it became mandatory to declare the ingredients of your paint on the tin of paint. Simple as that. And that would only bring it in line with many other products out there. In fact, most other products.
I was going to say, yeah. And the implications of this are that, because I'm right in understanding that Edward Bulmer Natural Paint, you guys do, and that's obviously not a mandatory requirement, but you're so confident in the quality of the ingredients that go into your paint that you're prepared to do that. I'm right in
that's correct, but also it might be a reason why you don't buy the paint. You might have an allergy or a belief system or something, but that's why, if you've got eczema, you should know if you're buying dairy milk or oat milk. These are your decisions. They shouldn't be my decision, because I'm the manufacturer and what's most important is my profit. And that transparency is the greatest weapon against greenwashing.
Indeed it is. Indeed it is. Well, look, Edward, that was, I know, a whistle-stop tour, but a fascinating sort of 55 minutes or so. Thank you so much for joining me for a show this morning. It was utterly brilliant and fascinating, as expected. Thank you.
Well, my pleasure, Charlie. And I have to say that I fully applaud your efforts. I suspect, like me, at times you felt very lonely and you thought, this is too hard. I'm just going to do something much easier but less important. So thank you for staying with it, and thank you for establishing a charter, which is a really useful tool for us in the absence of many useful tools, to show the consumer that there is something to think about here, and that that they might inquire what that means, because I think people have heard of greenwashing, but they probably don't know how deeply embedded it is, and that what it means to ensure that you're not being greenwashed.
Here, and thank you for those kind words, Edward. Let's leave it there. Fantastic to have you on.
My pleasure.
And that's it for today's episode of The Responsible Edge. A big thank you to Edward Bulmer, founder of Edward Bulmer Natural Paint, and a passionate advocate for truly sustainable design, for joining me on today's show. In this conversation, Edward and I explored the shifting business case for sustainability, from compliance to competitive advantage, and why design rooted in nature, culture, and transparency is essential to that transition. We touched on a number of other areas as well. Edward's an absolutely fantastic mind and thinker around all of these key issues around environmental sustainability in particular. As a reminder, this episode was brought to you by the Anti-Greenwash Charter, championing responsible sustainability communications. Visit antigreenwashcharter.com to learn more. I'm Charlie Martin. Thanks for listening. And don't forget to subscribe, share, and leave us a review. See you next time.